So our last speaker on our morning program is going to be Dr. Glynn Tonsor from our Agricultural Economics Department. This has been one of the, I'm not sure how many iterations of Cattlemen's Day that you've been here with us, but it's been quite a few, and it's become one of the highlights of our morning program, and so that's where we wanted to end today. So we'll kick you off. Thanks again for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you, Justin. Thanks to both you and AJ for all your coordination effort. For those that don't know, there's a lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes, and it's more than just you two, I know, but thanks to the team that pulls us off. Justin, I think the first time I did this, I was a lot nicer, more optimistic, had long flowing blonde hair. Yeah, we've been doing it for a while. That's a joke. I've been bald since I was 25 or 26, so I'm going to try to keep it pretty light. I didn't know, honestly, how much time I would have this morning. Anytime you have two administrators in front of you talking about new facilities and so forth, it's hard for anybody to predict how long it's going to go, and that's okay. The point of that comment is my slides are already posted to agmanager.info. I'm going to let this slide sit here for a second. You can see where they are. I'm not going to use every one of them. There's going to be a couple times I'm going to skip forward. I'll tell you when I'm doing it, so I'm not trying to make you seasick with a PowerPoint, but I have more slides than I need for roughly 30 minutes, but I'm not going to hide anything from you, so it's all available there. For those that don't know, while you're taking a picture, agmanager.info is the website over in AggieCon where we post all of our outward-facing outreach extension resources. Any public talk I give like this, you'll find a PDF of those slides. So this is the most recent one. Myself and all the other fellow ag economists, we have a page, and this just links to my page, but you can find a lot of these kind of resources there. I think I have 3 Excel-based decision tools that I'm going to highlight in my presentation today. They are all on Ag Manager, so please take note of this. You can find links to those resources and so forth that I'm going to reference as we go forward. Most of you know I like to try to start these kind of talks and then bookend it with the take-home point. So I'm going to give you a summary, lots of details, and a summary, and hopefully by giving you the summary twice, it'll sink in. I at least get that across to most of us. But my summary for where we're at and where I think we're going in the near term for the beef cattle industry is the supply dynamics are getting a lot of attention, but we can't lose sight of demand. The net of the supply dynamics is lots of chatter on herd expansion, and I'm going to spend some time talking about that. We haven't pulled the trigger on that yet. I have a hard time seeing that we're going to do much during 2024 on that front. I think we're going to start talking a lot about it, but just the numbers that are in front of us, so forth, I don't think we're going to have a net expansion this calendar year. We might start, but net not be a big deal. But by the time we get into 2025, my current broken crystal ball is we're in the midst of a strong effort to expand the herd, okay? We'll come back to that. As part of that, I think we're going to hear a lot of chatter. It depends where you're at in the industry, if this is good chatter or bad chatter, on capacity utilization. And what I mean by that is fixed assets like a feed yard or a stocker yard or a packing plant that need high volume throughput to run them have fewer and fewer feeder cattle coming at them for at least the next 2 years. And we could talk for how much longer than that. So capacity utilization is going to be a real discussion. In the middle of the pandemic, there's a lot of chatter about packing plant utilization. That exact same kind of logic is what I'm alluding to here again, because we have a reduced number of hooves to go through the system, right? So expect a lot of that chatter, certainly for the next 2 years. On the demand front, the good news for beef demand, maybe it's frustrating at times, but I think it's good news, is the majority of the challenges we've had, in my opinion, are macroeconomic in nature, nothing that is unique to the beef and cattle industry. And why am I saying that's good news? If there was an image problem or a perception that the product isn't of high quality or we thought it wasn't safe or something, that would be worse for the industry. Now, there's something you could do about that if it's an in-house demand challenge, right? So maybe it's easier to address it because you're not going to change the strength of the U.S. dollar or average U.S. consumer incomes and so forth as a beef industry. But I think it's important to appreciate consumer sentiment, I'm going to talk a lot about towards the end of these slides, is pretty pessimistic compared to a couple years ago, and that's weighed on meat demand broadly, not just beef. I think that's the main headwind for beef demand. That's frustrating because the beef industry can't do anything about it, but I'm trying to emphasize you have a high-quality product that people have shown they want when they are comfortable with the broader economic situation. That's my synthesis before I get into the details of that a little bit more. So my next 2 slides, I always bring a version of these, might be the ugliest 2 slides I have for you, and they are from LMIC, Livestock Marketing Information Center, that's based out in Denver, so not the LMIC that's here. These always get a little confused. This LMIC is a data and information aggregation group, so K-State and a lot of other land-grant universities, all the USDA branches, folks like Noble Foundation and so forth are all members of this group. They track lots of things. Me as a, the Key State member get access to it. I find it useful to synthesize some points. What you're looking at right here is quarter by quarter, so each row is a quarter, and then the ugly yellow lines are for the calendar year, is the supply side of where we're at. So you have the past year of 2023 on top, followed by kind of where we think we're going for 24 and 2025. On the left is commercial slaughter, in the middle is dressed weights. The net of those two gives us commercial beef production to the far right. The purple arrow tells a story. We're shrinking supplies. This is nothing new, but to give you some context about where we're at, in 2023, we slaughtered 4.3% fewer animals than we did in 2022. Dressed weights were on par with the year before. The net of that was beef production was down 4.7% in 2023 compared to 2022. What's the parallel story for this coming year? In 2024, expectations are to slaughter 6.5% fewer. Dressed weights are expected to go up, consistent with cheaper grain is the main driver of that. But the net of that is going to still be a notable decline in beef. Specifically, 5.3% less beef produced is what's forecasted for 2024 versus 2023. Go on out the next calendar year to 2025, more of the same, an additional 5.5% decline in hooves, all right, commercial slaughter, maybe some additional gains in dressed weights, maybe close to 5% additional decline in beef production, okay? You're not gonna find anybody disputes the direction of those. You could find some that dispute the magnitudes. Exactly where the dressed weights come in, we could argue that a little bit, but the punchline I would give you today is regardless of how much I move that dressed weight, we're gonna produce less beef. So you might get me off of 5% and 4.5%, maybe a percent different from that, moving the dressed weights a little bit, but you're not gonna change the tone of overall beef production, and therefore beef produced per person in this country is gonna be lower for the next 2 years. What does that mean for prices? This slide is set up the exact same way. Fed cattle prices followed by Southern Plains 7 to 8 and then 5 to 6 weights. The arrow goes in the opposite direction. Most in the room know cattle prices are quite a bit above where they were a year ago, and I have a few charts to show that. But quarter by quarter, looking out to 2024, 6 to maybe 15%, depending on what quarter we look at, higher fed cattle prices, maybe a 10% increase for the calendar year. When you break down the yearling and the calf prices, you quickly get to a forecasted $3 calf price. I'm gonna show you a specific example of that in a moment. I'm gonna say this about 3 times, I'll say it now. $3 calf price historically is great, and for anybody selling a calf, I wish them the best, but a $3 calf price doesn't pay the bill as much as it did 10 years ago. And I'm gonna pause and let that soak in, and to make my point, I'm not trying to be an ass, I think it's just important, is overall inflation in this country, and I looked this number up to be sure I was careful of how I said it, 29% higher today than 10 years ago. So the cumulative effect for collective in our economy, the all items, CPI, so we're not talking Dodge pickups or cows, we're talking for the whole economy, 29% higher than it was 10 years ago. So any rule of thumb you have in your mind about what something cost 10 years ago, much less 20 or 30 years ago, but 10 years ago, you need to multiply it by 1.3 to get an equivalent kind of price. So that's where my comment about the $3 calf price is coming from, is I wish those that are selling calves the best, and frankly, I think we're gonna sell them above $3 through this cycle, but it isn't the same as the old $3 is the point, okay? Looking out to 2025, additional price increases are expected, but they start to moderate, particularly for fed cattle. $3.40 is the highest number you'll see there for a calf price towards the end of 2025. I think there's a real possibility we'll be north of 3.5, and we'll sort of need to debate the expansion that some want to see. Those particular slides were dated at the end of January. I won't bore you why LMIC is about a month behind on updating them. They just are. But for context, you could be a little bit more bullish than those numbers I just gave you, given how the markets have adjusted basically in the last month. So one way to make this point, if you just go to the CME products and look across the different contracts, fed cattle prices are up $3 to $5 per hundredweight since then. So you could roughly go through these fed cattle prices and add, depending on which quarter we're talking about, $3 to $5 to those expected prices. And then the feeder cattle market's up 2 to 10, depending on, again, which contract I pick. So you could add to these forecasts both for yearling and calf prices. So what I printed here for you that's a month old would definitely be conservative compared to how I would tweak it today. I would bump them all up a little bit. Now I have half a dozen slides to talk about where we're at with the herd, mainly because there's a lot of interest in the discussion about expansion. and you will get some different opinions on when we're going to pull the trigger and how strong. I'm happy to take questions on that. But I want to start and kind of ground you with where we've been, so we all start from that going forward. In 2014, we had 28.96, so just under 29 million beef cows. The herd most recently peaked in 2019 at 31.7 million cows, and USDA tells us we started this calendar year with 28.2. So what I just described to you was this curve that's on the end here, and that's basically the typical cattle cycle. You have 5 or 6 years of growing the herd, 5 or 6 years of declining. We've been through versions of that many times before. We're a little bit lower than we were 10 years ago. Before I go to the next slide, I think it's really important to appreciate we get a lot more beef out of these cows, 28.2 million today, than we did basically the same number of cows 10 years ago. Same statement if I took these cows and compared them to the same cows 10 years earlier. The industry's more efficient, right? So collectively, breeding success, weaning success, all those kind of things have improved. You know, slaughter weights are up. So the net result is we get more beef out of every mama cow today than we did 10 years ago. You guys have heard me say that a few times, but I'm trying to impress it on you. We don't need as many mama cows to hit a given beef production target today as we did 10 years ago. So keep that in mind in terms of how large this herd might become, given that we expand. So 3 charts here kind of show you geographical placement. I should have said this earlier. USDA every January and most Julys puts out something called the Cattle Inventory Report. And for geeks like me, it's a lot of stuff to swim through. But it's USDA's best assessment of the number of mama cows, the calf crop, number of animals in feed yards, so on and so forth. And they do it state by state, which allows us to have these kind of figures. I just told you we started the year at 28.2 million beef cows. For reference, here in Kansas, 1.26 million cows is what they estimate we started the year with. I think it's more instructive to look at the changes. So this is the change, January 1st of 2024 versus the prior year. USDA estimates we have 51,000 fewer beef cows in the state than we did a year earlier. The country has 700,000 less than it did a year earlier. And a lot of that decline you can find between Texas, Missouri, just draw a circle here. Probably most importantly, you won't find what I'd call a major beef cow state that has a positive of any substance. So Pennsylvania is a big number 20 there, but pardon the pun to Pennsylvania, it's not a major beef cow state. So it's not moving the needle in aggregate, right? It's a small, for reference, they had 215,000 beef cows. So 10% is a big percentage change, but we're not moving the national herd with what's going on in Pennsylvania. Collectively, the herd shrunk, and it shrunk in many areas. Let's go back and do a 10-year look at that instead of just a 1-year look. So now we're comparing the January 2014 numbers with the most recent January of 2024 numbers. The herd as a whole is 733,000 cows smaller, but now you see some geographic differences. We started this year with a lot more cows in Texas and Oklahoma than we had 10 years earlier. This is where it actually pays to be the old guy, the way Justin kind of introduced me. I can sort of remember part of what was going on before 2014. A lot of the pull down in the herd going into 2014 was Mother Nature and challenges in the Southern Plains. So the cow herd in Texas and Oklahoma shrunk a lot in the 2 or 3 years leading up to 2014. So they had a small base number of cows in 2014. So here is the geeky statistician, a year-over-year change, in this case 10-year difference. You can make that number change by changing the old one or the new one. The number of cows that were in Oklahoma and Texas was pretty low in 2014 because it was coming out of, that was the source of the drought, or the main part of the drought. Some of you might remember there was a lot of folks, Texas cattlemen that didn't want to let go of their cows. They hauled their cows to Nebraska and put them on stocks for a year or two, and then they took them back, or some of them stayed in Nebraska. But that was going on because of challenges in Texas. So that's why you have this positive down here, 10-year story. Conversely, Kansas up through Montana, those are all sizable declines. And specifically to Kansas, 150,000 fewer beef cows than we had 10 years ago. I hope that gives you some context of kind of where we're at in this cycle. Again, almost all those states except for the 2 in the Southern Plains are down over those 10 years. And these 2 are up, but from a very depreciated base 10 years ago. The main implication of that, and where my capacity utilization comment came from in my summary, is fewer hooves in the system. So obviously fewer beef cows means fewer calf, right? Calf crop shrunk, therefore feeder cattle animals are down. This is the long-term pattern in that, going back to 1994. That same January USD report gives us some insight about how many animals we think are around the countryside that are not yet in the feed yard. We estimate we started the calendar year with 24.2 feeder animals that weren't in the feed yard yet. That is a full million head less than the same thing a year before. And it's about 2 million head less than at sort of the peak of this cycle in 2019. So there's just not that many animals out around the countryside yet to find their way to feed yards, okay? And I don't like saying this, but I suspect summer grazing programs, feed yards, and so forth are going to be chasing a fewer number of animals for the foreseeable future. This slide is where that comment's coming from. What about actual herd, heifer numbers? I made the comment we haven't pulled the trigger, at least nationally, on herd expansion. This slide is one of those that's let me say that, is 1.5% fewer heifers being held back this year compared to the year before. And fewer heifers, 4.9 million, being held back here that, were on the ranch in January 1st. Then we had going all the way back here to a low in 2011. So there's just fewer heifers being held back. We have not started nationally the effort to expand the herd yet. Where are we at the cattle cycle? Exactly where we've been every other time. This blue line is where we're at. We're basically year 10. Remember my comment, 2019, we were sort of at the peak on beef cow numbers. We've had about 5 years since then. Historically, that's roughly where we go, and then we start building the herd again, okay? Not that we have to follow historic patterns. 2024 is probably a little different than it was in the past versions of these cycles. But if you look at these, we're about the point historically where we would start the effort to expand. Here's a fact sheet I will remind you of. Glynn's punchline from this fact sheet: we don't need as many mama cows to hit a beef production target. I don't think we're going to grow the herd as much as some other people think because of that. Now, you may not like that or have to agree with me, but I get often asked, when we do expand, how many cows we're going to add back. You can't come up to me with an argument that we're going to get back to 33 million beef cows, because the amount of beef that would come from that would sort of overwhelm the market. The signals would quickly stop that, I think, because calf market would get depressed, is the punchline of this fact sheet if you want to read more about it. And if you're thinking about expanding your herd, to each is their own, and I'm not trying to talk anybody out of expanding, it's not the point of my comments at all, but I do encourage you to push the pencil and do some homework. We have an Excel-based tool that calculates what's called the net present value. So this is an economist resource that says, what's the value of adding this female as an asset to your operation? Basically, what's the value that would make you indifferent to buying it? I'll let you take a picture of it, and then I'm going to give you a couple example interpretations. Same link is at the top here. The way these Excel tools, and this is a shout out real quick to Kevin Duvetter. Some of you in the room remember Kevin. Kevin built lots of decision tools that are posted on Ag Manager. I just sustained this one, try to update basically the default things every year. The default or the starting point is that it costs you $950 cash cost to run a cow, that you expect 3% inflation, your discount rate on future earnings is 9%, and that you're going to take USDA's projected calf prices as gold initially. I'm going to change those on you in a minute. For reference, their forecast for 2024 is just below a $3 calf, so $2.95. If you shove all that into this tool, and I'm going to show you this in a bar chart in a minute, but before I lose you with the charts, the net present value of adding a heifer that's going to give me 7 calves, which is a starting point for a discussion, is $1,807. So to interpret that, what that tool is saying is if I could buy a heifer that I expect to give me 7 heifers for the next 7 years, so not heifers, calf for the next 7 years, and cost me $950 out of pocket expense to do that and meets these other presumptions, if I can buy it for under $1,807, I should do it. But if the market asks me to spend more than $1,807, and I believe everything else here, I'm locking in a lower expected rate of return than the 9%, is the way you interpret that, okay? I suspect in the next year we're not going to be buying too many 7 calf heifers for $1,807 is the point. So how do we change this to kind of match what I think the market's going to be doing? Well, what if I go in and I increase those USDA calf price projections by 10%? So I take USDA's estimates for the calf crop for the next 10 years and I scale them all up by 10%. So this is mimicking me being more bullish on the calf market is what I'm doing, okay? And I hold every else the same. If I do that change alone, you add $500 to the net present value. I'll say it again because I know I talk fast, is if you are 10% more bullish on the calf market for the next 7 years than USDA, you can rightly justify paying $500 more for a heifer than the guy next to you that isn't that way, all else equal, okay? That's these bar charts are the outcome of these kind of tools. That's not surprising, but that $500 probably feels big to some. And of course, if I went more than 10% or I went 20% more bullish, you'd add another $500, basically. So those that pull the trigger and pay a lot more are likely more bullish on calf prices than the default USD values I have in here, or they're understating their cost. So I put a $950 cash cost, and I think my comment there is pretty common. Folks underappreciate their cost. You can see that across here. Annual cow cost, or what varies across the x-axis on these tools. As you move to the left, so I've highlighted in red and then in green the $950 cash cost scenario. Over here is the default USDA prices. Over here is the 10% better than USDA, which is where my $500 comment's coming from. But in both cases, as you move to the left, we're mapping out what if you can run a cow cheaper. At the extreme, if you truly are a very cost-efficient herd and your cash costs are $700 instead of $950, if they're $700, then you could pay $27.37 using USDA's prices, or you could pay $32.74 if you're 10% more bullish on prices than USDA. So I'll say this again, those that are gonna pay larger amounts for heifers, and I think that's going to occur, are either more bullish on the calf market, as illustrated here, or they're making decisions as if their costs are lower. And if they truly are, economists would say that's a good move. If they truly aren't, then I would discourage it because you're locking in a lower rate of return than you might realize you're doing, is the point. So that's how you use this resource. To each is their own on the expansion and rebuilding decision. I'm not trying to talk anybody out of it, but please make use of this resource to at least have a kind of a motionless estimate of what those replacement heifers would be worth. All right, calf market, and I'll speed this up. $3 calves, we're already there. I'm gonna give you in a minute a forecast that we're gonna be $3, and that's probably conservative for this coming fall. Cash cost to run a cow have went up notably. I've said this several times, so I won't repeat it, but USDA's estimate for 2024 is $1,082 cash cost, not total cost. So you have to add fixed cost on top of this, and I would add roughly $400, maybe $450 fixed cost to that to get to a total cost of running the cow. That's easily $150 more than it was before the pandemic. And if we go back to 2014, last reference, $879, right? So for a lot of folks in the room, it's at least $200 increase in cash cost compared to where we were 10 years ago having this discussion about expanding the herd. My comment about 30% inflation, keep that in mind here too, right? None of that's unique to the cattle industry, but lots of those, just everything we buy, the Dodge pickup, everything, labor, everything is a lot higher than it was 10 years ago. I said Dodge pickup because I drive a Dodge. That's not a Dodge commercial. I don't care if you drive a Ford or Chevy. That doesn't matter. For reference here, what does this mean for break even? 10 to 20% of most cow-calf operations get revenue from cull cow and the balance from calf crop. I just split the difference for reference here. So if you get 85% of your revenue from the calves and 15% from cull cow, I can back into a break-even calf price that these numbers imply for us. What's up here is 153. So if you get 85% of your revenue from the calf crop, to cover that 1,082 cash cost and just break even, you need a calf price of 153. If I presume fixed cost of $450, so I add that on, now my total cost is 1,532 to run the cow. Now I need 217 to cover my total cost of the cow. That's the break-even calf price. The good news is the calf market's offering us well above 217, but this is where my reference on the $3 isn't what it once was. You need more than 217 just to break even, where it wasn't long ago 217 would have been a very attractive number. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm just trying to give you some recognition on the impact of inflation. This chart is from LMIC. It's returns over cash cost, goes back to 1996. For reference, in 2014, LMIC estimated typical person had a return of $534 per cow. No worries. The worst of this cycle was here in 2019, a loss of almost $200 per cow. Forecast for 2024 is a positive 504. And the big number that gets your attention at the top, feels big, is 690 is the forecast for 2025. These return over cash cost. And I think the general notion of this, we have better returns ahead of us, I definitely agree with. There's going to be notable arguments about the magnitudes of these. But to give you some reference on those magnitudes, I did this on purpose. I gave you my 30% inflation comment earlier because I knew I was going to throw it at you a few times. I'm going to do it to you again on this slide. So please note the 2014 return of $534 per cow, which is now 10 years behind us, if we take that 29% inflation that's occurred for the whole economy since then, that same 534 would equate to a $687 nominal return in 2023. So this comment about nominal versus real, these numbers feel big, but they're not as big as they really are when you consider inflation, is really what I'm trying to drive home. These numbers over here are right on par, and frankly, maybe a little bit behind where we were in 2014 once you adjust them for inflation, okay? So in my opinion, they are very viable given where the purchasing power of the dollar is today and the cost of doing everything in the cattle industry is today. I actually have done a version of this exercise that gets a 750, not a 690 number for 2025. I think that's very possible, particularly if costs don't further escalate and we pull the trigger in a different way. We pull some heifers out so there's fewer heifers on the market in 2025. That would be very bullish initially in 2025, but I think you could have well above a 700 number if that occurred. Okay? Most of you know I like to use beefbasis.com to get feeder cattle price forecast. Because we're short on time, I won't belabor how that works, but I'm happy to clarify offline if you're not familiar. The Salina market, as of, I did these on Thursday, projections from the middle of October. The projection for 6-weight is a $3 calf. I personally would consider, now I'm going to argue with the futures market a little bit. I rarely do that, but I suspect all else equal, we'll be above 301. I actually think the feeder cattle market's not bullish enough for this coming fall, given what's going on, how tight supplies are and so forth. If Mother Nature is nice to us between now and then, I think we'll start the process signaling we want to expand, and people will chase calves harder than that by the time we get to October. So Glynn would swag this to be more bullish than the $3 calf, is the point. This is an emotionless tool. It uses the CME futures contracts and historic basis to come up with a forecast, and that is the best way. Glynn's on the seat of his pants adjustment is not what I recommend you follow, but if you want me to know which side, I'd be a little more bullish than this currently. What about summer grazing? You can use the same resource to come up with a value of gain projection. The punchline of this is, what if here, a month from now, I'm going to buy or retain? One of these days, I got to fix this slide. I put retail there for like 3 years. It should say retain. Buy or retain a 750 pounder, and then I'm going to sell around Labor Day an animal that weighs 200 more pounds. It's out on feed on grass for 154 days. I expect I'm going to have to pay $262 a month from now for it. I'm projecting I'm going to be able to sell it for $250 around Labor Day. The net of that is a value gain of a little bit more than $2 per hundredweight, or $400 per head. Again, that is a large number historically, but that $400 doesn't go as far as it used to. So please compare it to your real cost. Feeder cattle risk management tool. I think this is the last decision tool. If you are in the business of selling feeders, whether it's calves, yearlings, or anything else, this resource was built to compare your alternatives to protect downside risk. So CME futures, buying a put option, the LRP product, those kind of things, that resource is there. Please make use of it. All right, yearling market is also up. Fed market is also up, but not as much. Leads me to this slide. This is where I'll speed up for a moment. Is every month I put out feedlot returns. What I'm doing every month is I'm taking information from this department, and thanks to Justin over here, and thanks to the feed yards in the state that work with Justin, the Focus on Feedlot survey is done every month. A small number of yards in the state always give us information. I'm taking the production data from that, so placement weight, sales weight, death loss, that kind of stuff from that exercise, and I'm marrying it up with Kansas feeder cattle, Kansas fed cattle, and Garden City corn price information to come up with some margin insights, both historically and projecting forward. The projections forward, I'm using the CME board heavily to do that. That's what you're looking at here. First shout out is thanks for those of you that do that survey. Please keep doing that. That helps me and helps Justin and anybody else that uses that effort. But the punchline here would be the first quarter of 2024, I'm projecting negative returns for the feed yard. And these would be for the quote unquote typical representative one in this exercise. Returns are projected to get a little bit better in the middle of the year. But the main reason for negative early and a little bit better later is the fed cattle market hasn't kept up with the feeder cattle market. And this is not uncommon at this point in the cycle, right? Calf market has led in terms of price increases ahead of yearlings, which are up, and they're both way ahead of where the fed cattle market is. And I'm not surprised at that at all. That's very common, but that's put this squeeze particularly on the first quarter returns. This is totally unhedged returns. So had you hedged at placement, your story would be different. This mimics somebody that's totally open to the market. They paid the going rate for feeders, paid the going rate for grain as they needed it, and then they took the going rate for fed cattle. So because of that, the returns usually in reality aren't as negative or as positive as I show, because in reality, a lot of yards, right, they mitigate some of that risk in both directions. All right, final comments. What about demand? I'm gonna put a shout out to Matt Perrier and his podcast. I belabored this point there, and I also just like his podcast, so it's a little bit of a commercial for him. But we sell beef through 3 different market channels, and I don't have time to talk about all 3 market channels. If you want to hear more about that, go there. The 3 market channels are domestic retail, so think grocery store for at home, domestic restaurant for away from home, and then export. Customers through all 3 channels are really important. I'm going to talk about the domestic channels today, but I'm happy to answer questions on exports. I run a project called the Meat Demand Monitor. It's beef and pork checkoff funded. It's a large survey-based project that started in February of 2020 here at K-State. We survey, I tell everybody, over 2,000 people. It's actually been over 3,000 every month for a couple of years because we're putting out a lot more information, so I've ran up the sample count. But we have a very deep look at who's buying what they're willing to pay for it, and frankly, why they won't buy, right? And we track things like vegan rates and so forth also in this exercise. So there's a wealth of information in this tool that I could give a whole day talk on, but I'm just gonna synthesize my macroeconomic point I gave you in the summary, that consumer sentiment is the main challenge. Specifically, the University of Michigan for over 50 years has run something called the Consumer Sentiment Survey, and they've tracked household sentiment on gas prices and home prices and so forth. It has nothing to do with cattle. They have some questions that I've put into this project to mimic and track household financial sentiment. In 2020, which is the first, February 2020 is when we launched this project, 15% said their household finances were better than they were a year before. 26% said they were worse than they were a year before. Remember what was going on in 2020. The pandemic happened, so forth, right? Lots of pessimism. In 2021, we had a notable improvement. 21% now told me their household finances are better than the year before. 22 and 23, we had a decline in financial sentiment, okay? So before I leave you with anything else, we had very strong meat demand in 2021, not surprisingly because household financial sentiment was up. The equity market had recovered. We had unprecedented transfers from the federal government to a lot of households, and people were willing to spend it on lots of things, including meat, okay? But that tone has changed quite a bit in the last 2 years, and this is weighing on meat demand, including beef demand, but it's not unique to beef. These 2 slides might make you seasick looking at the PowerPoint, but you can pull up the actual reports later. Earlier this week, I put out a special report for the MDM that broke down your willingness to pay, which is an economist demand measure, for retail. So think grocery store, that's what this slide is. And the next slide is food service. Separately by calendar year, and separately for those that are optimistic or pessimistic financially, okay? And I'm gonna put in English this. I really don't care about the numbers. The colors tell you the story. The colors in front of you, if they're green, that is good. If it's green, then somebody's willing to pay more for something than they were the year before. So demand grew for that group. And in 2021, which is the top of this, almost all of those are green. So willingness to pay for, specifically ribeye steak and ground beef, are the first 2 products that are up here, that's the beef categories, are green. Demand was higher in 2021 than it was in 2020, regardless of your financial sentiment. So whether you said your household was improving or not, you were willing to pay more than you were the year before. Get down to 2022, it gets much more mixed. Now the top row is green. That top row, and that's why I put a green arrow by it, is the households that said their finances had improved, which is about 18% of the public, were willing to pay even more in 2022 than they were in 2021. But the majority of the public fell into same or worse. Specifically, if you sum up 44% and 38%. So the bulk of our population was not reporting improved finances, and they were signaling we want to pay less, we're not going to spend as much at the grocery store. And that applied to the beef category as well. And then unfortunately, by the time we got out here to 2023, all those numbers are red because they're all lower than they were in 2022. So even those that said their finances had improved, it's still a small number, but they exist, we're now tightening their wallets. So the narrative there for the grocery store channel is 2021, we had strong beef demand, meat demand in general, and not just from the MDM. This shows up in other data sets as well, because people were better off and optimistic compared to 2020. By the time we got to 2022, it was a mixed bag. Some were more optimistic, experiencing improvement, and they were still paying up for some niche products and claims, but there's other people already tightening their belt. I would submit to you, if you didn't change jobs and didn't keep up with higher cost of living, you are more likely to be in the worse now bucket in 2022. By the time we got to 2023, everybody was tightening their wallet, okay? That's the punchline of that. The same thing held away from home. It's the exact same story, just the magnitudes are a little bit different for your willingness to pay for a meal that features a ribeye or a hamburger at a restaurant is the only difference here, versus going into the grocery store and buying it and taking it home. The last version of this is yesterday, we put out the February base report for this project. And again, these are different for better now, same, worse now. In February, 18% of the public says their finances are better than they were February of 23. However, 37% say they're worse. So there aren't many people optimistic on their household finances, okay? And the main implication of that is people are going out less. They're spending less away from home if you're not optimistic. They don't change their spending at the grocery store as much because they still have to eat. I would argue they're adjusting what they put in the basket to get to that same amount, but they're not going out for dinner meals and so forth as much, okay? So my comment about the three legs of the stool, the three market channels, why is that relevant? We push beef through all three channels, and the headwinds at the moment are stronger domestically through the restaurant channel than they are through the grocery channel, and that's important to note. All right, more on that's there. I'm gonna skip this because we don't have time, give you the summary and take some questions. The punchline of this is we're producing less beef. There's gonna be less beef per person available. We need a historically high beef price to be realized. Otherwise, demand declined, okay? And I could belabor that for 30 minutes. But as we take 4 to 5 pounds of beef per person off the market in the next 2 to 3 years, this industry needs to see a higher beef price come out of that. And you're gonna see that talked about in the media because the flip of that is consumer affordability, right? But it needs to happen, otherwise we have a demand decline. And if you want me to talk more about that in the Q&A, I will. But we're gonna have a lot of discussions, I think in 2025 in particular, about affordability of beef. And the beef industry needs to be ready to defend and frankly, want higher beef prices. Because if that isn't realized, you won't have higher fed cattle prices, yearly prices, and calf prices. Okay? Hopefully you guys follow my summary point. I think for the sake of time, I'll just leave this up. The punchline is, I don't think we've started expanding the herd yet. I anticipate we're gonna do that hard in 2025, if nothing big changes between now and then. That's kind of a cop-out statement because we can't go 3 weeks without something big going on these days. But if Mother Nature enables it and we don't have massive changes in cost and so forth, I think we'll start rebuilding the herd and we'll see that show up in 2025. And if that occurs, we'll be taking a lot of heifers out of the system in 2025, which will be extra bullish for the calf market initially. So keep that in mind. I don't think we're gonna hit 33 million beef cows. For reference, it was 31.7 was the number we had in 2019. That's sort of where my head is roughly the ceiling to think through on the next cycle. Historically, we don't tend to go to a new high. We tend to go a little bit lower on highs because we don't need as many to hit a beef production target. That's the flip of an efficiency gain for the industry. But the punchline of that is we might add 3 million at most beef cows back. Probably not more than 3 is Glynn's opinion. Demand side, keep it up because majority of the challenges are outside of your control. They're macroeconomic, consumer, incomes and finances and so forth. They're not product quality and safety. Randy's in the room. We're not talking E. coli recalls the same as we used to and so forth, right? So we can't take that for granted. We got to keep up our game. But that isn't the reason I'm sitting here saying we've had some demand challenges. Most of the demand headwinds are outside of the industry. Hopefully 24, 25, so forth, the economy starts doing better. And more importantly, household sentiment with that does better. And that would be a demand pull if realized. So I'll shut up there and take questions. I know I stand between you and I presume beef for lunch, so. Yes, Ray.
First of all, I'm still trying to get past the long flowing blonde hair.
Yeah, if my wife was here, she'd be kicking me in the shins. That's never been the case, yeah.
The third leg of that stool that you mentioned, the export market, though, is really important. What do you see over the next 3 to 5 years in beef export and meat export in general? And how's it going to impact us, consumers and producers?
Yeah, so I'll repeat because I'm not sure everybody could hear that. The question was, I didn't talk on exports. What do I see coming, basically, and what are the impacts of that? We export more beef, pork, and chicken as a country than we used to because the global demand for our products has grown notably. That's a long run statement, not year over year for a moment. And I think that's actually a testament to the comparative advantage of producing meat, frankly, in North America, not just the US, compared to where population and income growth has been. So to give you a country example, Japan has a long history of importing a lot of beef and pork products from the US because they consume a lot larger volume than they could ever produce on that island nation, right? We have the corn base, we have other things here that they don't have to do that. I don't think any of that's gonna change. The majority of the population and probably income growth is gonna be in parts of the world where there isn't a grain base and an animal raising base. So North America, and around this out, I think South America will continue to be the meat production part of the world, and we'll see more and more meat hitting ships going to the rest of the world. None of that's new. I don't think that will change, primarily because of comparative advantages of where we produce things relative to where more people live. Population growth in Asia and specifically Africa for the next 20 years is going to be the driver of that. Beef export demand is slipped the last 2 years. I think there's several reasons for that. Our products got expensive on the world at the same time that other countries got concerned on their own macroeconomics, and there was some shifting to cheaper products. So US pork export demand has grown in the last 2 years. So there's been some shifting from beef to pork by foreign buyers in the recent term, but Glynn's very broken crystal ball for the next, if you let me say next 5 years to get a little beyond 1-2 year stuff, is I think we're gonna export more of all three major meats, beef, pork, and chicken. What does that mean for consumers here is all else equal, there's less pounds here to consume. Because per capita consumption, I've done this to about half of you in the room before, is what do we produce plus imports minus exports, and we divide that tonnage number by the US resident population to give you a available number of pounds per person. So all else equal, if we grow exports, we have fewer pounds of beef, pork, chicken, whatever it is, to consume here in the US. If the foreign buyer values those products more than a domestic buyer, that is a great outcome for the local industry, in this case, the US beef industry. But the chatter in the newspaper will be is, why is the beef leaving home, right? So there's a political reality to that I'm not, trying to ignore here. I think we're going to import more beef in the next 2 years, partly because of that, because we're producing less, and we want to continue particularly ground beef volume flow in this country. So there's an import and export flavor to that that we all need to keep in mind, and that's why I put that three-legged stool up there. Thanks.
Would you comment about beef on dairy? I mean, any increase in beef production because of the dairy, beef on dairy?
So would I comment on beef on dairy? My number one comment is it's very hard to get third-party verified data on how prevalent it is. So you can hear a wide range of numbers on the prevalence. So just to put some context on how prevalent that is, the most common numbers I hear are 10 to 20% of our current beef production is coming from a beef on dairy system. I can't dispute that. I mean, that kind of passes my smell test. There's ongoing discussion. I don't think that will stop anytime soon. And in the real short term, if I ran a feed yard or any other intermediate industry that has capacity that exceeds the current beef feeder numbers that I alluded to earlier, you have an extra incentive to bring in an animal that's half dairy to occupy the hotel kind of thing, right? So I think in the near term, we have an extra pull that individual business decisions are gonna want beef on dairy even more while we're in the process of rebuilding the beef herd. And one of the outcomes of that existing is we don't need as many beef cows, in part because we're starting with a dairy cow, which might be why you're asking me. It's not the reason I don't think we'll hit 33 million beef cows, but it's on the list of reasons that we don't need as many. I don't have them with me. I don't have the Kansas number right now, no. Yes, sir.
So, are you suggesting that the replacement and holding of heifers is starting this year or will start the year?
Yeah, so Tom's asked me to clarify, when will the holdback efforts start? I think there's some people in this room and individuals more generally around the country that will start this summer, but the aggregate of that I don't think is gonna be big. I think in 2025 is when the aggregate of that will be big. And the reason I'm answering it that way is if you run an operation where you're at 30% below what you wanna be because the drought hit you harder than others, then you have a stronger signal to start that sooner. And there's gonna be some people that do that now. But if you're sort of average and you're down maybe 10%, then I think you're more likely to be cautious and not pull the trigger hard this summer. It is the net of everything I hear. So I don't think we're gonna see the trigger pulled hard this summer, but the following one. One man's opinion. Ask me again in a year if I'm right. I also fully believe we're going to expand more than my tools say we should, because we've always done that. We're debating the timing of it here, but yeah.
So I saw, I think you're close to one of your last slides showing consumption, consumer consumption going down. So I'm starting, there's several in this room that I would consider a baby boomer like me that expand that by an X or so. But I'm hearing stories of these younger generations. I seen a study by the Pork Board put out that scares me of where they see this younger generation. And I think theirs was more on the fresh side. What's your take on the meat? Do they carry the same way?
Yeah, you and I probably need to go get a steak and talk 6 hours on this one. So this is a national average. This room certainly on average will be well above this, right? So this is roughly a pound of beef per week on average. Most in the room consume well above that. But the point is, there's a lot in this country that are well below it to get to this number. So recognizing that diversity is step one, right? And you get it, I'm saying that for the room. The Pork Board in particular is worried about the generational shift. I work a lot with the Pork Board specifically on loin demand. So pork chop demand is a real challenge for that industry. I've been part of projects, they call it the value at stake. Maybe the report you've seen, I'm not sure which ones. And they're very concerned about the generational shift. Glynn's opinion across proteins, so this isn't beef or pork specific, but across proteins, is those that are trying to sell protein to folks that are younger than me, and for reference, I'm 43, but I look like I'm 80, but I'm 43. So if you're younger than that, we need to get off of the mindset, everybody wants 10-ounce center of the plate main entree. I will eat that, and most in this room will eat that, but that is the minority in the US. They want something smaller and usually smaller and more convenient. And there's been a couple times in the last year I've made the comment, you can take the same 12-ounce beef item, cut it into 3-4 ounces, and there are some younger generation that would pay well more than 3x per pound for the convenience that comes with that. The trick is you got to meet them where they want it, right? So how do you get the 4-ounce convenient item that might have sticker shock like no other, like nobody in this room could even believe anybody would pay, but if it's a high quality product that checks the boxes and it's convenient, some of those higher income, younger consumers, we need to do that, right? And that's just a fancy knife exercise in that example. But we need to move off of trying to sell things the way we sold it to ourselves 20 years ago. And I would say that not just for beef, I'd say for all the proteins.
When is that, you see some retailers particularly pricing, not per pound like you know, we've done forever, but per piece.
Or per package.
Right, and that price per pound is way, or some higher than what we see otherwise. Is that, part of that is here's your meal cost, not
right.
per pound cost?
Yeah, Matt's calling out some in the industry already sell in a different way, not per pound. I think that's a part of it, but honestly, I don't think that's the number one reason they're doing that. I think the number one reason folks are selling per package is for certainty on expense. Frankly, sometimes because somebody can't do the math on dollar per pound equivalent. That's an indictment on our public school system and so forth, as an aside. My kids are in public school, but you get the joke. But the certainty on a budget, I think, is why they're doing it. So if I put a $20 stamp on it, I know when I go up front it's gonna be 21. But if I put $12.99 a pound and I don't read the fine print on the total package, I may not know what that's gonna be, right? And if I don't have the 21st dollar when I get to the front counter, I got a problem. So I think it's certainty on total package cost is the number one reason. And then for some, it's what you're alluding to. Yeah. And the best way I know to say that is you're not gonna find a high-end ribeye product quite sold that way. You're more likely to find a ground product or an assortment pack or something sold that way. So you're targeting a different consumer base. Thank you. Anytime this man stands up, I know I'm about out of time, but I'm not going anywhere. I'm happy to take more questions. I know I went fast at the end. I was trying to keep us somewhat on time, but thank you.
This concludes the morning session. Quick housekeeping. Lunch is next. Okay, brisket lunch sponsored by U.S. Premium Beef. There will be Call Hall ice cream down in the arena floor, sponsored by Huva Pharma. As you exit, in just a moment, but as you exit, please exit and go up the stairs and straight over to the arena. We will be serving 4 separate lines at the top. You know, the big track all the way around. So if you go up the stairs and straight up over by the Heritage Room, that'll be the best way to go in and get your lunch. Some of you may have noticed that there's quite a few youth in attendance that have been roaming the hallways as you know throughout the morning. I just want to make sure everybody's aware that we have a concurrent youth event of 120 high school students from throughout Kansas to bring them here to get them some exposure of Cattlemen's Day, get them exposure of what Kansas State and the Animal Science Department is all about. So just a little tidbit that we're doing that on the side as well with kind of the main course being Cattlemen's Day. So with that, we will be back in here at 1:30. You've got a little over an hour before I start hounding you through the microphone to get back in here, where we'll be getting some research updates to keep you up to speed with everything we're doing within the department. Thank you.